The following is a editorial by Andrew J. Shatkin, attorney at law and author of several books. In the New York Times editorial page of June 28, 2016, the New York Times stated that the Supreme Court's decision to strike down the Texas anti-abortion law was a significant victory in a generation for women's rights. The 2013 Texas law forced abortion clinics and its doctors to meet very strict medical standards. The New York Times ended its editorial on this issue with a statement that this ruling should spell the end for many, if not most, of these regressive, unconstitutional laws, and noted that the court has looked the other way as lawmakers around the country have sought to weaken or obliterate a woman's right to reproductive freedom. Let me say that I make no comment on a woman's right to abortion. What I do comment on here is New York Times blindly ignoring the extremely significant, compelling moral issue. The issue of life of an innocent unborn or of the dying, disabled, or retarded is a stupendous moral issue. The court focuses on women's rights, but the issue is not women's rights. It is the issue of destruction and death and deprivation of another life. I am a Lutheran Christian, and I support all rights of all people, whatever their race, gender, sexual orientation, or national origin. I abhor all forms of discrimination, but the Church's position on this issue cannot and will not be altered. The Church recognizes and places eternal value on every life, whether living, dying, disabled, or innocent and potential. New York Times speaks of reproductive freedom, and I speak of ending someone's life. That person who has been taken out of this world prematurely could be the next president or the scientist who finds a cure for cancer. I say to the New York Times editorial staff that if they had been the subject of an abortion, they would not be writing the New York Times. I asked the New York Times that if their children were the subject of an abortion, would the Times only have to say and talk about women's rights and reproductive freedom? I find the New York Times' position on this issue an example of shallow, politically correct thinking, which ignores the fact that people are being thrown into cardboard boxes and garbage cans. I would now like to talk about another column in the New York Times by David Brooks entitled "The Revolt of the Masses." Mr. Brooks seems to refer to a particular culture. He says that culture was and is the working class. He is quite detailed on what the working class believes and does, and says that this culture values physical toughness, people who are willing to fight to defend their honor, a culture that is concerned with sports, and that this working class pride is nationalistic. Mr. Brooks talks of the cosmopolitan cultural elites and says that there is a rift within the working class between the old, often bigoted, and the young, more tolerant and open to the world. Mr. Brooks says that the Trump and Brexit voters are in this group. Mr. Brooks concludes and speaks of the liberal elites, who he says have pushed too hard, and also speaks of the less educated masses. I find Mr. Brooks' reference points in which he speaks of the uneducated masses engages in a large number of assumptions about them, including the very disturbing statement that the older group here are bigoted. As a Lutheran Christian, I find Mr. Brooks' statement and the title of his column, "The Revolt of the Masses," extremely disturbing and intellectually incorrect. I do not know what Mr. Brooks means by masses, but I can only conclude that he sees people who work in manual occupations and who are not terribly well educated as inferior. I have to remind Mr. Brooks that the disciples of Christ were fishermen, Jesus was a carpenter, and St. Paul was a tent maker. As I have stated before, Jesus Christ pronounced the poor and masses blessed. Mr. Brooks' analysis here is skewed. It is quite apparent that Mr. Brooks regards himself as extremely superior to people who are less educated, and that merely work. I must remind Mr. Brooks that in our system, the masses that he refers to have political equality and an equal vote with the elite and educated. It is quite clear that the founders of this country rightly concluded that the people have a wealth of intellect fully equal to the educated or wealthy. One might say, "I am a member of the masses," to Mr. Brooks. Where I differ is that as a lawyer, I do not find the working population of this country intellectually deficient. I would like to comment on the column of Mr. Christoph entitled, "What Religion Would Jesus Belong to?" in the New York Times of Sunday, September 4th, 2016. Mr. Christoph notes that Jesus was concerned with the poor and correctly states that he identified with the poor and challenged the establishment. He says that the Jesus we meet in the Gospels was not anti-poor, anti-gay, anti-intellect, anti-immigrant, or anti-science. Mr. Kristof says that Christianity is not a set of beliefs, but a moral system based on compassion and living a loving way of life. Mr. Kristof says that people no longer believe in the resurrection, or the virgin birth, or biblical miracles. Mr. Kristof wishes to reduce the Christian religion and Jesus to moral and ethical teachings. That is well and good, but he ignores the fact that Jesus made a claim of divinity, did heal people, or was reported to have healed people, and made a claim to rise from the dead and offer his believers eternal life. Mr. Kristof can choose to reduce the Christian religion to a moral system, but he is engaged in philosophy and not theology. Mr. Kristof chooses to read out those sections of the Gospels that he feels have been superseded or are antiquated. I agree with Mr. Kristof that Jesus embraces a moral vision of the world. Where I differ is that Mr. Kristof wishes to dispose of everything else that he finds not in line with the modern world and with science. Once again, the New York Times takes positions in its editorial and columns that I find distressing and lacking. Finally, I comment on the New York Times May 29, 2016 column by Mr. Kristof entitled as "The Liberal Blind Spot." He speaks of bigotry against the LGBT community, yet fails to address the moral basis in this area. That he disagrees with that moral basis is his right, but I would ask him to address it. He says that the university should not hire a nincompoop who disputes evolution. My response is that everything has a cause, from a cathedral to a table and a maker. Evolution could well be the truth, but I find that it fails to account for how this world and humanity came into being. I would say to Mr. Kristof that there is nothing in this world that happens by accident. Mr. Kristof's birth was not an accident, nor was it an accident that he wrote the present column I speak of. I simply say to Mr. Kristof that causality is present in everything we do from the time we get up in the morning to the day we die. Respectfully, Andrew J. Shatkin.